About 12 years ago, a guy by the name of Eric Schlosser was in Colorado Springs writing a book. I got to know Eric at that time. He wrote the book Fast Food Nation, which lit this country on fire about our food system. Why did he pick Colorado Springs? Well, when he was a kid, he went to the Sanborn Ranch camp up on the mountain, and wow, this is a beautiful place. And so as a child, he found out that Colorado Springs was a beautiful place, and particularly the camp up on the mountain. And so he kept coming back to Colorado Springs, and he saw Colorado Springs evolve as a city. And so when he was doing the book Fast Food Nation, this is what he saw. He said, in the fast food restaurants of Colorado Springs, behind the counters, amid the plastic seats, in the changing landscape outside the window, you can see all the virtues and destructiveness of our fast food nation. I chose Colorado Springs as a focal point for this book because the changes that have recently swept through the city are emblematic of those that fast food and the fast food mentality have encouraged throughout the United States. Countless other suburban communities in every part of the country could have been used to illustrate the same points. The extraordinary growth of Colorado Springs neatly parallels that of the fast food industry. During the last few decades, the city's population has more than doubled. Subdivisions, shopping malls, chain restaurants are appearing in the foothills of Cheyenne Mountain and the plains rolling to the east. The Rocky Mountain region as a whole has the fastest growing economy in the United States, mixing high-tech service industries in a way that may define America's workforce for years to come. And new restaurants are opening there at a faster pace than anywhere else in the nation. Fast food is now so commonplace that it has acquired an air of inevitability, as though it were somehow unavoidable, a fact of modern life. And yet the dominance of the fast food giants was no more preordained than the march of colonial split-level golf courses, split levels and golf courses, man-made lakes across the deserts of the American West, the political philosophy that now prevails in so much of the West, with its demand for lower taxes, smaller government, and unbridled free market, stands in total contradiction to the region's true economic underpinnings. In the potato fields and processing plants of Idaho, in the ranch lands east of Colorado Springs, and the feedlots and slaughterhouses of the High Plains, you can see the effects of fast food on the nation's rural life, its environment, its workers, and its health. The fast food chains now stand atop a huge food industrial complex that has gained control of American agriculture. During the 1980s, large multinationals such as Cargill, Conagra, and IBP were allowed to dominate one commodity market after another. Farmers and cattle ranchers are losing their independence, essentially becoming hired hands for the agribusiness giants or being forced off the land. Wow. Since Eric said these words, we have lost 98% of our pig producers, over 50% of our ranchers, 35,000 cattle feeding operations have gone out of business. 86% of our dairy farmers are now gone and out of business. And we have transitioned into an industrial agriculture. Wenonah Hauter comes to us from Food and Water Watch in Washington, D.C., where she is the executive director. I've known Wenonah about 15 years. We started out together raising heck with meat packers. And we've been at it, and we've never given up. And I'll tell you, Wenonah has really been a spark plug. She has been the one with the ideas and the strategy, and her organization has really executed unbelievably. This organization and Wenonah are smart, they're strategic, and they are not afraid of anything or anyone or any corporation. They never back down and they never give up. And this book, Foodopoly, is an awesome follow-up to what Eric Schlosser described as the problem. Wenonah continues to talk about, but even better, she's talking about solutions. How do we fix this mess? Welcome, Wenonah.
Thanks. I got mine. Thanks, Mike. Well, it is terrific terrific to be here in Colorado Springs, and I have to say that Mike is a real visionary, and he is a really unusual person in that he was not willing to back down to the meat packers, and he took it all the way to the end, and they tried to ruin him, and he's come back with Ranch Foods Direct, and it's an amazing local food operation, and I really appreciate the invitation to be here tonight. So I got interested in food because I grew up on a farm. When I was 11, my parents decided that it was time to get back to the farm. They were missionaries and they didn't have a whole lot of money. So we ended up on this really, really funky farm about 45 miles from Washington, D.C., up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. But, you know, in those days, D.C. wasn't what it is today. In fact, it would take us about an hour and a half, an hour and 45 minutes if you wanted to go into the city because there were all back roads. Of course, today, it takes about that long to get out to my farm because of all of the hideous traffic. And I was really lucky. I ended up inheriting that farm, and my husband runs it as a community-supported agriculture project feeding about 500 families in the D.C. area. Now, I learned a lot on that farm. I learned about how much work it is to squish potato bugs and to pluck chickens and to chop kindling, because my dad didn't believe in folks taking it easy, and he never got around to putting the plumbing in that old farmhouse. So I can tell you when I was 18, I was really happy to leave the farm. But I kept going back, and I think a lot of my values really came from that experience. And it's why I am so fighting mad about what's been done to the family farmer. Now, I decided, and the people that I work with at Food and Water Watch, our terrific staff, we decided that it was really time to write a book that tells the history of how we ended up getting this dysfunctional food system, because if we don't know where we've been, we really don't know where we're going. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me as I talk about a little bit of farm history. And I think it's also the history of what's happened to our economy and why so many people are suffering today, both farmers and a lot of urban workers. So you'll remember in the 1920s that the financial services industry had been misbehaving, kind of like they have recently. And our nation was in a horrible depression. And no one was suffering more than farm families. We lost about 1 out of 6 farms during a 5-year period leading up to the 1930s. And when the Roosevelt administration came into office, they wanted to do something to not only help urban people, but to help family farmers and rural people. About 54% of our population lived in rural areas at that time and on farms. And so during the first few days of the Roosevelt administration, they were able to pass a farm bill. And during the first few years of the Roosevelt administration, they were able to institute a number of policies that actually made it affordable and profitable to farm, and that stabilized prices for consumers. And many of these policies are things that we should reinstitute today. They did things like create a grain reserve so that when it was the weather was terrible and crops failed, that crops could be pulled out of a grain reserve that was actually stored in silos in farmers' fields. They instituted a number of supply management programs that meant that there was not overproduction, which is really one of the causes of farms going out of business, because prices are low, because there are too many crops. They created programs to make it certain that farmers could actually make the cost of production, which is one of the main problems that happens today when farmers and livestock growers can't actually get what it costs to produce whatever they're growing for food. And these programs worked really, really well. And in fact, during World War II, the US really provided food for the Allies. After the war was over and Europe was devastated and the colonial governments were falling, the US was still providing food for many nations around the world. But something really changed during the war, and I think we all know this from our history lessons. The US had become an industrial powerhouse. The center of finance had moved from London to New York, and there were a group of very prominent business leaders and political leaders that believed that the time for agriculture was over, and that really what the United States needed to do was to put their resources towards developing industry. And a number of these business leaders got together and they created an organization called the Committee for Economic Development. And I have to tell you that before I wrote Foodopoly, I'd never heard of this organization. But as I read through a lot of the historical documents and reports that they did, and the individuals that were involved in this organization, I began to understand how the lobbying had taken place to really change the way we deal with agriculture in this country. Now, some of the original organizers of the Committee for Economic Development, and originally they saw this as a volunteer organization for a number of gentlemen who met in clubs and knew one another socially. I'm talking about people like Paul Hoffman, who went on to administer the Marshall Plan in Europe under the Truman administration, who was one of the directors of the UN Development Program, and went on to be the president of the Ford Foundation and one of the architects of the Green Revolution. There were a number of business leaders like this. There was a gentleman who was on the cutting edge of research about how you change consumers' minds. And they believed that farm boys, especially farm boys coming back from World War II, should not inherit their families' farms, that really capital should replace labor, that chemicals and technology can replace labor, and that farms should be much, much larger, and that it didn't make sense to have all of these very small, diversified farms, that really more vertical integration and more global trade of food products was the future. And, you know, I'm not suggesting that this is some kind of wild conspiracy. I think this was just a situation where a group of prominent business leaders with a lot of resources and political connections got together and began to develop a strategy that was very effective. Over the first 15 years of the Committee for Economic Development's existence, 38 of its members held public office. 2 of its members were actually presidents of the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, they weren't able to actually begin chipping away at the New Deal farm policies until under the Eisenhower administration. And there was a Secretary of Agriculture during this period named Ezra Benson. And Ezra Benson was an ideologue. He believed that the New Deal farm policies that made diversified family farming possible were actually going to lead towards communism. And you'll remember that this was the McCarthy era, and that there was a lot of concern about a communist takeover of the US. It seems a long way ago now. But he was able to begin chipping away at the policies that allowed farmers to make the cost of production. In the 1960s, the Committee for Economic Development had become very prominent. In fact, the 2 co-chairs were also the presidents of the Ford Company and Sears and Roebuck, and they had recruited most of the economic departments of our most prominent universities, many of our most important institutions like publishing houses and other large newspaper concerns, really important institutions in our society. And the Committee for Economic Development worked with a number of the economists that were involved, and they wrote a report called an Adaptive Plan for Agriculture. You can actually still look it up on the internet and see references to it. And this plan basically talked about why it was necessary to get rid of any of those policies that remained from the New Deal, like the grain reserve and the reduced ability of farmers to make the cost of production. And they believed that it was really necessary to get more labor out of rural areas and, you know, I would say basically a rural depopulation strategy, even though they didn't call it that. And they also talked about the future being in really the global trade of food products, that it didn't make sense in a nation like the US to be producing high volume or products like fruits and vegetables that take a lot of labor, that the US should really be a grain powerhouse, not a country that grew all of its own fruits and vegetables and produced all of its own products. And this adaptive plan for agriculture actually got a lot of press. It got a lot of coverage because of all of the institutions that were involved in it. And it was distributed to members of Congress, and it became kind of the common belief that the New Deal ag programs needed to go. But it took a couple more decades to get rid of the last vestiges. The next really dramatic thing that happened in agriculture happened under the Nixon administration. And it was really a protege of Ezra Benson, who was the Secretary of Agriculture during that time. And I think some of you might be old enough to remember Earl Butz. Anybody remember Earl Butz? Earl Butz was quite a character for those of you who are young, but you hear people kind of snickering. In fact, he eventually got fired by the Ford administration for making racial slurs and for having represented the U.S. In Rome at a food meeting and making salacious remarks about the Pope, kind of lewd remarks. So he was a real character, and he believed that farmers needed to get big and get out. And he went around the country lecturing farmers, telling them that they needed to borrow a lot of money, they needed to buy a lot of equipment, they needed to buy a lot of land, and they needed to really start producing a lot of grains, because the U.S. was going to become a grain powerhouse. And there was only 1 year in the 1970s that the U.S. was a grain powerhouse, and that was right before the McGovern-Nixon election, when Earl Butz helped put together a big grain deal with the grain traders like Cargill and ConAgra. They made $2 billion on this grain deal, and the price of bread went way up in the U.S. But the idea that Earl Butz presented to President Nixon and his inner circle is that this grain deal with the Soviet Union would make it possible for farmers to make more money, and they would vote for Richard Nixon. And he, of course, did win that election. But what happened to family farmers is really heartbreaking, because large numbers of farmers did borrow a lot of money, putting their farms up as collateral, buying a lot of equipment, raising a lot of crops, and there was massive overproduction. And that meant that this was the period that we began to lose millions of farms. In the 1930s, there were about 6.8 million farms. Today, we have under 1 million, even though the USDA says we have more, but they kind of fudge the numbers. So the permanent agricultural crisis that we're still in today really began during the Nixon era. Now, the 1970s, a lot of things began to change in the US, and one of the arguments that a lot of the largest economic interest in the country made was that it was necessary for companies to get a lot bigger so that they could really compete with companies from countries like Japan. And a group of these industries began raising money and looking for a candidate to really carry out both a deregulatory program and a program to get rid of antitrust law. And a couple of these industries are agribusiness and the oil industry that were very instrumental in helping Ronald Reagan be elected. And one of the first targets was that those antitrust laws that had worked really well since the late 1940s, because both political parties through those decades had really believed that it was important to have vigorous competition. I mean, after all, we do have an economic system that's supposed to be based on competition, and they believed that it was dangerous to have companies become too large because then they get too much political power. But in the early 1980s, when the Reagan administration came into office, one of the first things that they did was appoint ideologues to the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice, which are the two main agencies that oversee antitrust laws. Those are the laws, of course, that prevent monopolization and ensure that we have vigorous competition amongst our different industry competitors. And they did exactly what you would expect. Came into office, cut the budgets, got rid of whole departments, stopped a lot of the investigations that were going on. And I think probably most importantly for the long term, dramatically narrowed the definition of what an antitrust violation is. And we've really been living with this situation ever since then, because our antitrust laws were really eviscerated at this time, and we have not had strong antitrust enforcement, even of the weak laws that are on the books since that period. Now, what happens when companies get a lot bigger and a lot wealthier? Because when a company gets bigger, it also gets wealthier. It means that they have a lot more resources to spend on influencing public policy. And that's exactly what happened in beginning in the 1980s. We began to see the weakening of our democracy, and that public policy was being determined more and more through a system of legalized bribery, campaign contributions, and lobbying. And the food industry was one of the industries that was most affected. Now, going into the 1990s, one of the things that was being discussed was trade rules, a new set of trade rules that would encourage more global food trade. And what happened is that Cargill, the giant grain trader and big meat processor, really big food company, decided to put together a coalition of about 100 food companies to really have an impact on the way that food policy was written for the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and the North America Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. And what they hoped was that this coalition with a lot of different companies that really had different economic interests, that the discussion could happen in this coalition and that they could come to an agreement and really have a unified approach to the policies that they were advocating for these trade agreements. And in the end, they did. And Cargill actually wrote the agreement on agriculture in the World Trade Organization with the idea in mind that food should be produced where it's cheapest to produce food, where labor is cheapest, where environmental laws are the weakest. And this has had a very dramatic effect on our food system. Now, once the U.S. had become a party to the trade agreements, there was a lot of pressure to get our farm policy completely in line with trade policy. And I always say that what Ronald Reagan began, Bill Clinton really finished, as far as really destroying the enforcement of antitrust law, because not only was the Clinton administration one of the biggest boosters of these trade agreements that really are for the benefit of companies, not people, the Clinton administration really didn't enforce even the weak antitrust laws on the books. And in fact, the flurry of mergers and acquisitions really began under the Clinton administration. And I think one of the most probably detrimental consolidations that we saw was with the media, the mainstream media. In the beginning of the Clinton administration, there were 50 large media companies that had already begun consolidating. By the end of the Clinton administration, we had 5 major media companies left. And it was really under the Clinton administration that began to, the meat packing industry began to really consolidate. And of course, the Clinton administration had a very strong relationship with companies like Tyson and Walmart. And I'm going to talk about Tyson a little bit later. So this had a really bad effect on our food system. And the consolidation just began accelerating. And the farm policy in the 1996 Farm Bill really began to destroy what was left of family farms. And what happened is that the 1996 bill was called Freedom to Farm. We all know that any piece of legislation that has freedom attached to it is probably really dangerous. And it deregulated farm policy and eliminated what was left of those New Deal programs, like the grain reserve, that China's had a grain reserve since AD 54. Got rid of the supply management mechanisms that meant that there wasn't overproduction, because there are a lot of economic interests from grain traders to food processors who like overproduction because it means that they have access to cheaper inputs. So they were able to just completely change farm policy. Now, very quickly, farmers were beginning to call this legislation freedom to fail. In the first couple of years after the bill passed, and it took actually, it was very controversial, it took 2 years to pass the legislation. The first couple of years, the price of corn dropped by 50%. The price of soy dropped by 40%. And farms were going out of business right and left because when there's overproduction, it costs a lot of money to put in crops, a lot of money is borrowed, and if you can't even make back the cost of production after a year or two, you're really sunk. And so Congress, in its wisdom, rather than taking a look at the policies that they deregulated, decided to use taxpayer money to prop up corn and soy production, and to make sure that farmers could kind of totter on the edge of going out of business, but continue to overproduce. So, you know, we always hear it's the farmer's fault that they grow corn and soy, which really is a lot of nonsense. You know, this is federal farm policy. And so, you know, I've been talking about a lot of kind of heavy and boring farm policy. I want to just talk a little bit about who really benefited from this deregulation and consolidation. And I want to just do a kind of a real quick, well, I'd call it an exercise, but it's, you know, it's more of a little test. So I want to ask you who benefited the most from these cheap commodities. And I'm going to read a list of brands, and then I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you've ever had one of these brands. And I just want you to know that I would be raising my hand. This is not being the food police here. And then I want to ask if anybody has an idea of why I might have listed this particular list of brands, just to illustrate what consolidation has done. Okay. Pepsi, Mountain Dew, Aquafina, Sierra Mist, Tazo Sobe, Slice Lipton, Propel Gatorade, Tropicana, Naked Juice, Captain Crunch, Aunt Jemima, Near East, Rice-A-Roni, Pasta-Roni, Puffed Wheat, Harvest Crunch, Pasta-Roni, Puffed Wheat, oh, I said that already, Quisp, King Vitamin, Mother's, Lay's, Maui Style, Ruffles, Doritos, Cheetos, Rolled Gold, Sun Chips, Sabritones, Cracker Jacks, Chester's, Grandma's, Munchos, Smart Food, Baconuts, Matador, Hickory Sticks, Hostess, Miss Vicky's, Munchies, True North. Anybody? Nobody has their hand up. So why did I read that particular list of brands? That's right, and PepsiCo is the largest food company in the United States. Do you think that those products are food? Is that being kind of generous, calling those products food? Well, that's just, you know, I'm being kind of silly, but this consolidation has meant that we basically have 20 companies, food processing companies, that control more than 60% of the brands when you go into the grocery store. So it looks like we have this, you know, great diversity and all of this wonderful products and all of the color when you go into the grocery store. But really, we have very little choice. And these food companies have used their political power to dictate most of the rules about how our food is produced, from the pesticides our children are exposed to the fact that we have weak labeling for ingredients like genetically modified ingredients. I mean, every single thing about our food system has really been dictated by this small cabal of companies. The fact that our children see on average just below 5,000 TV ads for junk food every year. You know, we don't hear much about the role of advertising in the obesity epidemic, but they've figured out, these companies, that children at the age of 3 have brand identification, and they want to attract children at a very young age to identify with that brand that they believe, based on research, they will buy throughout their lifetime. And children are very important determinators in what the family eats. So, you know, I think that this is really pretty draconian, and especially when you consider that these companies have worked with food scientists to figure out how to create foods that addict people using a combination of fat, sugar, and salt. And you've probably seen a lot of the recent coverage and books written about this, but they actually figured out that when people eat this combination, that it triggers a hormone in the brain, and they want to go back for more, and more. And so this is really kind of the center of the problem with our food system. But I will say that these food processors are not at the top of the heap. At the real top of the heap are the grocery industry, because we have a few chains that have enormous power over the food processing companies because of their need for volume. We have 4 grocery chains that control, in many markets, rural markets, suburban markets, 70 to 90% of sales. And overall, they control about 50% of sales. And Walmart is at the top of that food chain. 1 out of 3 grocery dollars today is spent at Walmart. And Walmart uses television advertising to hammer home everyday low prices so that people expect low prices, even if it means very poor quality. And the Walmart heirs have as much wealth as the bottom 40% of Americans. And I think that's kind of a metaphor for what's wrong with our food system and what's happened to our economic system as more and more foods are produced in countries like China. About 50% of the value of food products is, in some years now, actually produced overseas. And I want to just devote a little time to picking on Tyson tonight, because, you know, I think it's pretty shocking, and you know, I guess I'm going to bite the hand that feeds us, because I know Bon Appetit is a sponsor tonight, but I think it's pretty shocking that Bon Appetit is using Tyson to supply chicken to the university, because, you know, we've done a lot of research at Food and Water Watch about the poultry industry. And one of the things that I did in writing Foodopoly is I went and visited one of these poultry operations. Very few people in the poultry industry will speak out about the horrible conditions for the birds, but for the workers too. And there are a few people who are getting really fed up, because these contract growers are literally serfs. They actually refer to themselves as serfs. They make an average of about $12,000 to $15,000 because Tyson and the other small group of poultry growers have meat packers have figured out a system where the grower actually has to build the giant warehouse. The grower is responsible for the waste that's generated, any lawsuit or any problem with spills. And these warehouse facilities have as many as 300,000 chickens in them. I went into one of these facilities, and I tell you, I was so choked. I don't know how you could even go in. I mean, I literally cannot even look at a piece of chicken since that time. But what they've done is they prey on the very poorest people in rural areas who have very few choices and who are often trying to save the family farm. Our USDA will guarantee the loans so that they can get a loan for this big chicken facility, and the grower usually puts up their property for collateral. And then Tyson or whatever producer that we're talking about They own the genetics of the birds. They own the chicks. They actually bring the chicks. Takes about 45 days to raise a chick to be a broiler. They own the feed that is laced with antibiotics and arsenic in many locations, because arsenic actually accelerates the growth of poultry and kind of gives it that nice pink quality that it has. And then the industry representatives come and check on the birds and really are very involved in growing them. Now, after about 45 days, then the contract chicken catchers that the company contracts with come in and pick up all these birds that are crowded together and don't have enough room to turn around, and pick them up by their feet and put them in the trucks that that Tyson owns, and takes them down to the slaughter plant that Tyson owns. The grower gets paid based on how much weight the chickens have grown compared to how much feed Tyson has given the grower. But the grower doesn't ever get to see how much the feed weighs, and they aren't allowed to be present when the birds are weighed. They have to kind of take the industry's word about this. And then the bird is slaughtered in this Tyson slaughter plant, and Tyson, along with some other meat producers, has been lobbying the USDA to speed up the slaughter of birds. So today, birds are slaughtered 175 birds per minute. And to get rid of the bacteria, the birds are dipped in different chemical baths like chlorine and usually trisodium phosphate. So I say that Bon Appetit should not be using Tyson meat. And so, you know, I really didn't write Foodopoly, though, just to be this bummer who talks about all of the problems and how rotten the food system is and how we really can't eat anything. I really wrote Foodopoly to make the case that, yes, we should vote with our fork. We should go to Ranch Foods Direct and buy good meat. We should go to local producers who are growing fruits and vegetables. But it's not enough to just vote with our fork. We also need to vote with our vote, and we need to begin to hold these people we elect accountable. And I think it begins at the local level. And I think it begins with a lot of the issues that are exciting people. We've seen massive campaigns now around labeling genetically engineered food. I think the industry overreached when they spent $60 million to defeat Proposition 37 in California. And this year, we've seen 35 states have some kind of campaigns to label genetically engineered food. We've had legislation pass in a state like Connecticut. It's going to pass in Vermont. We know the feds, the FDA, is now talking about some kind of labeling. And I think more of this legislation or initiatives will pass, like the initiative in Washington state. And it's generated all this grassroots support. And when people get involved in one campaign and win, it inspires them to get involved in the next one. And there are a lot of other issues to be working on. And a lot of the political action that we need has to start at the community level, right? And you know, you have some great issues here. I think the idea of the public market is absolutely brilliant because, you know, we need public space. We need places that people can actually go, get together, can buy the healthy products that they need, but that can have the room and the opportunity to talk, to strategize. And so I really support what you're doing. And I think that Mayor Bach should be ashamed of himself, and that it's time for some local campaigns around that issue. So, I think all these political debates do start at the local level. I think we have to pay a lot more attention to the state legislatures, though, and I think that's one of the places that there's been a lot of weakness the past several years. And, the state legislatures, every 10 years, redistrict. And we've had a lot of really bad gerrymandering in a lot of states. And that's why we have a Congress that is completely dysfunctional. The House of Representatives, where we have a lot of members of Congress that I don't think are representative of the American people. So I think it's very exciting, the opportunities to take these kind of local issues to the next level, to grow our homegrown candidates, help them become leaders and get elected. And really, I see a lot of hope amongst young people, amongst people who are really mad and really want to take back our democracy. Because I think if we're really going to fix our food system, we're going to have to fix our democracy, right? And there are a lot of campaigns beginning to have a constitutional amendment to undo Citizens United, and I think that that's pretty exciting, and if people working on a lot of these different issues can come together, and that's how we're going to bring the change that's really necessary. So I think I'm probably going over time, but I want to thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Wenonah.
Thank you, Mike.